Everyone to today's webinar, Regulating Groundwater Quality Across SGMA, CV Salts, and ILRP. I know many of you are just getting admitted to the webinar. For those of you who are not acronym wizards, we'll be discussing the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA, the Central Valley Salinity Alternatives for Long-Term Sustainability, or CV Salts, and the Irrigated Lands Program, or ILRP, and how each of these efforts can work collaboratively to support water quality improvements across the San Joaquin Valley. And this conversation today is part of a webinar series coordinated by Maven's Notebook and Local Government Commission, focused on how we can better collaborate across sectors, regions, and state programs within the California water world. And some of you may have attended a previous webinar that we hosted on successful collaborations between SGMA and the Integrated Regional Water Management Program. But for those that missed it, I'll post that recording in the webinar chat now. And we will continue that series on SGMA and IRWM later this year in partnership with the IRWM Roundtable of Regions. So stay tuned for more info there. And with that, my colleague, Chris Austin, who many of you know as Maven from Maven's Notebook, is going to begin by launching a quick poll to get a sense of who's with us today. So Chris, if you want to go ahead and launch that. You can go ahead and select which of those best describes you. We'll give everyone about 20 or so seconds. While Chris is launching that poll, I'm just going to walk through a few housekeeping pieces and ways that you can best participate in today's webinar. Everyone, as you'll see, is automatically muted. We do encourage you to submit your questions throughout the panel discussion. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see the Q&A function. Chris, just something in the chat. It looks like they don't see the poll, or one participant does not.
Okay, it is launching and I am seeing, oh, the poll came up.
Okay.
I think there's a little bit of a delay.
Okay, great.
And also this has all of the questions because I forgot to delete them.
Fantastic. Well, you'll see then, if you scroll down, you'll see there are 4 questions listed in the poll. So not only are we going to get a sense of who we have in the room, but we're also trying to get a sense of how familiar you are with the 3 programs that we'll be discussing today. So within your poll, you should see 4 questions, 1 to identify what best describes you, and then the other 3 on the 3 programs that we are addressing today. While you're completing the poll, just a few last minute pieces around the webinar. Again, we'll be taking questions throughout, so you want to make sure that you are submitting your questions through that Q&A function. I know there are also lots of resources around these topics, and we encourage you to share links to resources in the chat. We will be holding all questions until the end of the panel for our moderator to address with our panelists. So any questions we don't get to, we'll try to track those and make sure we can follow up with our panelists. Chris, how are we doing on the poll?
I think
most folks.
Yep, 81% people are still voting. Let's give people a few more seconds to finish up.
All right.
Okay, I think that's everybody. So I will end the polling and we'll share the results.
All right, so who do we have with us today? It looks like the majority of our participants describe themselves as consultants, followed by government agencies coming in next, and non-governmental organizations as our 3rd most popular attendee. Welcome to everyone, no matter where you're joining us from today. In terms of familiarity, it looks like we have about 63% of you are somewhat familiar with CV salts, which is relatively good, I would say, for this program. And then on ILRP, if you continue scrolling down, we've got about 50% of you who say you're somewhat familiar, so slightly less for the ILRP program. And then on SGMA, we have 46% So actually slightly even less familiar with Sigma, which is interesting, I think, for the topic that we have today. Although we have 45% of you who say you're very familiar with Sigma. So with that, Chris, I think we can close the poll and I will turn things over to you to give us a brief overview of the topic.
Okay, great. Thank you, Emily. And thank you everyone for joining us today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Chris Austin. I'm known in the internet world as Maven, and I publish Maven's Notebook, a California water news website that brings together water news from media outlets all across the state, but also covers meetings, workshops, conferences, and webinars. I also publish another website called the Groundwater Exchange, which brings together resources for implementing Sigma from around the internet and organizes them in one place. So if you're looking for information on Sigma, visit groundwaterexchange.org. Now, the CV SALTS program is a topic that I've written about on Maven's Notebook a number of times, and you can't attend many workshops or seminars on CV SALTS without running into our first speaker today, Tess Dunham, now an attorney with Kahn, Soares, and Conway, LLP in Sacramento. In many presentations, Tess has often talked about how CV SALTS and Sigma can be integrated, but only as part of the presentation and discussion. So I invited her and all our other great panelists here today to speak with you about this in detail. And at the end of our time here today, I hope you will have found some ideas and some actions that can make implementing and complying with Sigma, CV SALTS, and the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program a little bit easier. And at the end of the webinar, there will be another poll on what future webinar topics you might be interested in. So do be sure to stay for that. Now, Tess Dunham has spent the last 20 years specializing in legal and regulatory issues related to state and federal water quality laws, including the CV SALTS and the Irrigated Lands Program. A farmer's daughter, she represents a wide range of clients and coalitions devoted to resolving nitrate, salt, and other water quality issues to promote long-term sustainability of California's water resources and ensure the needs of farmers, private industries, and municipalities are balanced against environmental concerns. So I'll turn it over to Tess now to give us an introductory presentation. Welcome, Tess.
Thanks, Chris. Maven, so much for having me. I'm going to share my screen here. I just have a few slides to try to help give an overview for where we're at with the program. So then we can get into the best part of the day, which is the question part. So let me get this going into slideshow mode. So again, thank you. Tess Dunham with Kahn, Soares, and Conway, and I'm going to just give us a quick overview with respect to Sigma, CV SALTS, and the ILRP and kind of how they interconnect with each other, and then we'll get into the questions in the Q&A. So first of all, there's a lot of acronyms that have been thrown out there. We obviously are in an acronym-heavy topic here, but let's see if I can break them down a little bit. So in defining the acronyms, we have SGMA, which I'm certain most of you understand is the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act of 2014. It was adopted by the legislature, and its primary objective is really to reach groundwater sustainability in 20 years. CV SALTS is the Central Valley Salinity Alternatives for long-term sustainability. It is a collaborative, stakeholder-driven and managed program to develop sustainable salt and nitrate management plans for the Central Valley. It resulted in amendments to the water quality control plans for the Sacramento and San Joaquin River basins, as well as the Tulare Lake Basin. It created what we call the salt and the nitrate control program, and each of them have their own silos, but I'm going to focus primarily today in the overview on the nitrate control program. It is established through regulations. Water quality control plans, or basin plans as they are often referred to, are regulations that go through the Office of Administrative Law. Those basin plans, or these regulations, are then implemented through permits. This is where the ILRP comes in. The Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program is actually a permit program and is done through the issuance of 12 or 13 or 14, a number of general orders known as waste discharge requirements that apply to coalitions throughout the Central Valley, or actually they apply to the growers, but they are administered through coalitions. But again, it is a permit under the Water Board's authority to authorize discharges of waste to waters of the state. I like to make a good comparison between SGMA and ILRP and CV salts, as SGMA is about what is coming out of the ground. CV salts and the ILRP is much more about what is going into the ground. So that's one way to differentiate between the two. So another key component is really understanding the statutory difference and the agencies that administer SGMA versus those that are involved with CV salts and the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program. First of all, SGMA, as you all know, is primarily administered. Its regulations are adopted by the Department of Water Resources. There is a function, a backstop function for the State Water Board that is coordinating with Department of Water Resources. It is focused on sustainable groundwater levels, and the management of sustainable groundwater cannot lead to undesirable water quality impacts. That is the nexus to the water quality component with respect to SGMA. I think an important component to recall with SGMA is any past groundwater contamination or exceedance of water quality standards that may already be in the groundwater is not necessarily needing to be a part of a SGMA or a groundwater sustainability plan. In comparison, under Porter Cologne, which is where CV salts derives its authority, or the Basin Plan amendments derived from Porter Cologne and the Irrigated Lands Program, this is authority that's administered through the State Water Board and the Regional Water Quality Control Boards. They have the primary authority to regulate for water quality, including authorization to require cleanup of any past contamination. So they do both. They allow discharges of waste into waters of the state now, and they can issue enforcement actions to require people to clean up any past contamination. SGMA is implemented through local agencies called groundwater sustainability agencies. They are derived through statutory authority through the Groundwater Sustainability Management Act. And of course, they manage and regulate groundwater in a basin or a sub-basin. State intervention can come through if there is no local agency or if there's an inadequate plan. And of course, based upon the time frame of whether you're in a critically overdrafted basin or not, you have sustainable groundwater management needs to achieve over a 20-year time period, depending upon the overdraft nature of the basin that you're in. So through CV salts, we have implementation of the nitrate control program through management zones. There's often a lot of questions as to how does a management zone differ, or is it the same as a groundwater sustainability agency? They are different. Management zones are actually a regulatory construct within the basin plan, and they come together in a contractual basis for a number of dischargers. It is not legislative. It is not through statutory requirements. Again, it's a regulatory construct in the basin plan. It allows you to define the area for discrete regulatory compliance with respect to the discharges of nitrate into groundwater. It is a cooperative for implementation of a management plan, again, on a contractual basis, as compared to the groundwater sustainability agencies, which have a legal statutory basis. The whole idea with a management zone is collective implementation for ensuring that nitrate impacted areas and those that use groundwater that have nitrate, groundwater that's contaminated with nitrate, that they have a means to safe drinking water, both in the short term as well as the long term. It is imposed and enforced on irrigated agriculture through the Irrigated Lands Program. I think it's important to note that basin plans themselves are not typically self-implementing. There are a few exceptions. And so they then have to be incorporated into a permit process in order for the regional board to maintain authority to enforce the implementation thereof. This is where the Irrigated Lands Program comes into CV salts, is it needs to make sure that the Irrigated Lands permit is consistent with the basin plan, including the nitrate control program. I think it's important to look at why there's such an overlay in the Central Valley between the three programs. And we're going to see that here as we kind of walk through a series of maps, right? So here we have the SGMA priorities, and we have the high priority areas in the orange and the medium in the yellow. So I think we all have always understood that the SGMA priorities, there's a lot of heavy emphasis in the southern San Joaquin Valley and in, starting just south of Sacramento. The critically drafted over basins, as was shown in 2016, again, is the South San Joaquin Valley, looking in the Merced, Fresno, Visalia, in that Tulare Lake Basin area, a little bit in the San Joaquin Basin, less in the Sacramento Valley. In comparison to our nitrate areas, I think you see a clear overlay that the nitrate priority areas under the CV SALTS program are very much aligned with the critically overdrafted basins within SGMA. So we clearly have groundwater challenges and issues in this part of the Central Valley. We have our red and our orange areas, which are our priority areas for nitrate under the Nitrate Control Program. Now let's take a look at the Irrigated Lands coalitions. You will see here, although the map doesn't go all the way down, you'll see here where we have our coalitions, and starting with coalition number 5, which is the East San Joaquin, and moving down to number 7, which is Kings, and 9, which is Cahuilla, and then we have the Tule. Moving down the valley, you again see that overlay between the coalitions that are implementing and administering the Irrigated Lands programs as compared to the SGMA priority areas, the critically overdrafted basins, as well as the priority areas for nitrate within the Central Valley. So what are these key commonalities between all the programs? Some of them are pretty obvious. First one, of course, is they're all pertain to groundwater. They are all ground zero for overdraft and nitrates, as we just saw from the maps that we went through. And I didn't get into the actual implementation actions that they are each required to do, but there's a lot of similarities. Under SGMA and the groundwater sustainability plans, the GSAs need to come up with a plan for sustainability. They need to consider potential impacts with respect to water quality based upon implementation of the groundwater sustainability plan. In comparison to the management zone plans for nitrate, these are also going to be long-term plans, but on how do we address and manage for nitrate in our groundwater to hopefully have it recover in areas where we have contamination over a time period. I think in my mind, there's going to be overlays. A lot of the plans and the for sustainability are going to overlay and potentially help us determine, can we meet water quality standards for nitrate moving forward in the future, especially when we look at projects such as recharge with clean floodwaters or surface waters, stormwater. How does that help us in the long term with respect to nitrates in groundwater as well? Another key commonality, of course, is a lot of it is the same people are paying for all of it. In the Irrigated Lands Program, those in agriculture are assessed per acre fees by their coalitions to administer the Irrigated Lands Program. They also pay a fee to the State Water Board through the coalition for the State Water and the Regional Water Board's administration of the Irrigated Lands Program, as well as some of the basin planning functions. The management zones, which will be implemented through the Irrigated Lands Program, again, will be assessed on a per acre basis through the coalitions, more than likely than not, as we're starting to see these management zone plans develop. Groundwater sustainability plans, those costs are going to be imposed on those growers that pump. So when I go out and talk to the grower groups, the first question I almost always get is, are we going to be paying for all 3 programs? Is there duplication? We can't afford all of this. What does this mean? How can we have efficiencies? I think another common component here, of course, is the whole idea is still local management. While there are state agencies involved for oversight and enforcement, but all of the programs are looking at how do we manage things on a local basis, whether you're talking about an irrigated lands coalition that is set up on a kind of a watershed basis, or you're talking about a management zone, which is set up on some type of a groundwater basin or sub-basin basis, as well as groundwater sustainability plans that are also stood up on a basin basis. The idea is through local control, I think we can get to better solutions, and hopefully through local control, which this state has provided through some of the discretion in all of these acts, we can avoid the duplication of cost to those that are going to carry the burden in large part for the cost of these programs. And for many of that is the Irrigated Lands Programs. For the nitrate control program, there will be others that also contribute and pay, but a good component of that is going to fall on irrigated agriculture. So that's the quick overview that I have, Chris, and open to questions, or whether we want to get into the panel questions, which I think will be the most interesting part.
Okay, thank you, Tess. That was great. So now I'm going to introduce Daniel. Let me find my place here. Sorry. Okay, yes, thank you. That was very helpful for that background and framing. I now want to introduce you to today's panel moderator, Daniel Cozad, the Executive Director of the Central Valley Salinity Coalition. Welcome, Daniel.
There we go. So I turned my video back on, and behind me you see some of the recharge basins. There's part of one of my jobs, but we're happy, Chris, to be here and to talk about the intersections of these different programs. The panel that you have today have worked together, argued about things, found solutions, and generally collaborated in a number of different ways. And so it's my privilege to be able to moderate questions. I know there have been some questions posted already, but please feel free to do those. I've got a couple questions for the panelists, but once we get through those, we'll be going to the questions that you're asking. So Chris and Emily, thanks so much for doing the laboring arm of putting this all together. And to the, what does it say, about 252 of you who are signed into the webinar. That's great. We're happy to see you. And I see a number of names that are very familiar, and some that are not familiar to me. So I'm hoping everybody's going to learn from today. So each of the panelists has kind of a different role and perspective. So certainly you heard from Tess Dunham, who's worked with a number of entities in the Valley, and also works with the CV SALTS process. We also have Natalie Stork, who's the Chief of Groundwater Management Program for the State Water Resources Control Board. So it heads up their role in the GSAs. And finally, we have Jennifer Clary, who's the California Director for Clean Water Action, and been present at lots of CV SALTS meetings. So welcome all of them, please. To get us started off, let's think about some things you've all been engaged in on this topic, just to answer a few more questions. I know, Tess, you began talking about how GSAs and their GSPs are similar to management zones, and the work that management zones are doing to put together their preliminary management zone plans and early action plans. How come, how did it come that GSAs, since they came before CV SALTS was finalized, came after CV SALTS started, but before CV SALTS was finalized, why didn't they just get tasked with doing this with a greater water quality requirement?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. Actually, there was a lot of discussion with respect to how the groundwater sustainability agencies and the development of the GSPs may interplay and overlay with the management zones. As the legislation was passed in 2014, we were well in the middle of our discussions as to the nitrate control program at that point in time, but clearly we had not finished. There was a lot of questions of why don't we just make the groundwater sustainability agencies the lead entities for the management zones? At that point in time of the process, it was determined to leave the development of the management zones within the basin plan a little more flexible. The idea being that we knew the GSAs were going to have a heavy workload as it was to get organized and get themselves developed and develop the groundwater sustainability plans. Management zones would have the same issues as well. And we firmly believe that organically, we think that the GSPs and the GSAs are going to come together and be a part of the discussions with the management zones. But the authorities, the legal authorities were so different in some ways with the basin plans and the need and the regulation of those that discharge nitrate under the basin plan and under the regional board's authorities. There just wasn't the clear legal overlay with respect to the groundwater sustainability plan. So the basin plan absolutely requires and encourages the management zones to work with the groundwater sustainability agencies. I know that a lot of the GSAs are in communication and working. Some of the GSAs have more of an interest to taking a lead in management zones. Others may not. It's going to vary throughout the state. But we left it open so that they could, but it was not mandated because we didn't think we had the legal authority to mandate it.
That makes sense and goes along with sort of the forerunner of GSAs, which was to empower local entities to figure out which should be working together and to tackle the issues for that. If there's nitrate overlap between CV salts and the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program, certainly you describe them both as being what goes into the ground. How do those two, how does that overlap work, and why is it not one program, or why is it not, how does that work together?
So as I said, the basin plan is the regulation, and the Irrigated Lands Program is the permit mechanism that the regional board has to then implement that regulation. So the Irrigated Lands Program was actually adopted in advance. It has been revised. The orders have been revised once or twice as the CV salts was getting approved to incorporate those requirements into the Irrigated Lands general orders. So again, the basin plan is the regulation. It's not self-implementing. The regional board then has to take those requirements and impose them on the Irrigated Lands Program through the general orders or the permits. And that's how the two come together. Now, there's clearly a lot of overlap. You know, nitrate is a big issue within the Irrigated Lands Program. It's a fundamental, you know, we need fertilizers to grow our crops in California. But it is, you know, we do have issues with respect to nitrate contamination of groundwaters. And so we will be implementing, the regional board gets its enforcement backstop by requiring compliance with the nitrate control program in the Irrigated Lands general orders.
Great. I think there's the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program leads have been very involved in both CV salts as well as the management zones. And I think they've benefited from both of those programs and their close interaction between the two of them. There was a couple of questions that I noticed came up. One is, who is Emily? And Emily and I think all of the other panelists have bios, and Emily's going to post them for you. And at the right point, Emily, if you want to say more about who you are and what your role is here, you can certainly do that for folks who were not here at the very beginning for your introduction. But I had a couple questions for Natalie in the regional, essentially the state board's review and role. So what are the specific SGMA authorities that apply to water quality, and how should GSPs be addressing groundwater quality?
Great. I'll talk a little bit about GSAs and the requirements around water quality. And then I can talk a little bit about the state water board's role and how that fits in. So when it comes to SGMA and water quality, the big place where it comes in is that SGMA requires all of these groundwater sustainability agencies, when they're developing their plans, to identify the potential undesirable results in their groundwater basins. And undesirable results are the significant and unreasonable occurrences of those 6 things, the 6 sins of SGMA, as some people call them, caused by groundwater conditions occurring throughout the basin. And one of those 6 things is degradation of water quality. The specific language is significant and unreasonable degraded water quality, including the migration of contaminant plumes that impair water supplies. So the place where GSAs are defining that is in their groundwater sustainability plans. And DWR developed their GSP regulations to spell out in more detail how to cover that in their plans. And so GSAs need to describe that water quality undesirable result through their development of sustainable management criteria. I'm getting into a lot of jargon here, but there's minimum thresholds and measurable objectives where they need to stay away from what is an undesirable result and what they're shooting for. And then of course, steps to get to where they're shooting for. So the important thing is that what an undesirable result is when it comes to all 6 of those things, and including water quality, is defined by locals at the local level. So it's up to GSAs to determine what's undesirable in their basins. And then the next step is those plans, of course, were submitted to the Department of Water Resources, and their job is to review those plans and provide a determination on whether or not those plans are adequate. Before I jump into more on DWR and State Water Board roles, just want to touch a little bit more on the authorities that GSAs have to address water quality. The SGMA statute was helpful in that when GSAs adopt their plans, they get a suite of new authorities in case the agencies that form the GSA didn't already have these authorities. Some of those authorities include you can purchase water, you can import surface water, you can treat surface water, or not surface water, I'm sorry, you can import surface water, you can treat water generally, groundwater or surface water. You can desal, you can do all kinds of projects, and the statute made sure that these authorities were there, or the legislators when they developed the statute, so that GSAs could do what they needed to do to avoid those undesirable results in their basins, of course, to be defined. That doesn't mean a GSA has to start doing desal or treating groundwater, but the options are there. And so GSAs have a whole new suite of authorities to address water quality issues in their basins. And the important thing is that GSAs, they have also the authority to regulate groundwater extractions, which is really, SGMA is, about inputs and outputs and sustainability basin-wide, and not having those undesirable results occur anymore, especially when we get to 2040. And they have several different ways to do that. And one of the big ways is by regulating groundwater extractions. So when it comes to the roles of DWR and the State Water Board and how we fit in and how we're looking at water quality in these plans, I can't speak for DWR, I'm not DWR, but their role is to, they developed those regulations on GSPs, and now they're reviewing GSPs for these 2020 basins that submitted their plans this January. And they have 2 years to make a decision on whether or not the plans are adequate. The State Water Board's role is we have the state intervention role. So if a GSA is unable to manage their basin, to pull a plan together, or if DWR determines the plan is inadequate, that's when it becomes up to us to decide whether or not to step in a basin and start implementing our state intervention role to get the basin back on track. We have many different options when it comes to state intervention. It's discretionary. There's an open and transparent public process. There are board hearings for all the major steps. And our focus, if and when state intervention happens, is to collect data in that groundwater basin in case we need to write our own plan to get the basin back on track. So our main vehicle for collecting that information is groundwater extraction reporting. So figuring out what people are taking out of the basin. But the board does have broad authority to ask locals to conduct special studies to get more information. If there's water quality issues, we could theoretically ask for more information on water quality, or we could work with what's already there. And we'll be taking in that information in case we need to write our own plan called an interim plan to really get the basin back on track. And then that is intended to be temporary. Once issues are fixed, we would hand the basin back to the locals for them to carry on with their plan towards 2040 and sustainability. So that's sort of a long roundabout. Sorry, that was a very long answer to what GSAs need to do around water quality and the roles of the State Water Board, why we're involved, why we're here.
So the state board has a role in the Irrigated Lands Program, and that they have approval over the basin plan amendments from the regional board, and certainly have a role in oversight of the CV salts and the role you just described in sort of the SGMA program. How do you, as a state board, how do you integrate? That's your area of the world. How do you integrate all those together and help us make them work together?
Well, that's a great question. It's something that we're working on right now. The SGMA team, the ILRP team, the CV salts team, the ILRP and CV salts teams at Region 5, we communicate with pretty regularly, also the ILRP team at Region 3. And looking at the overlaps between our different programs. And we definitely have some overlaps, especially with stakeholders. As Tess showed in the map, much of the Central Valley is thinking about CV salts. There's management areas and plans that are going into effect. And the boundaries don't perfectly align with those GSAs, but there's a lot of crossover there. So we have crossover with stakeholders. We have crossover potentially with monitoring. Any monitoring that's going to be done under CV salts, they could look to what GSAs are doing, or GSAs could look at CV salts and fill in those gaps in their monitoring networks and sort of hit two birds with one stone when it comes to monitoring what's going on in their basins. And water quality, of course, is the big point of overlap there. The important thing is that SGMA, the authorities of SGMA, don't supersede any other water quality program and vice versa. So GSAs, coalitions, et cetera, they need to make sure that they're in compliance with both programs. But when it comes to that overlap, we are having many conversations between the state and regional board staff to look for opportunities, to look for tools and messages, for points of crossover that can help, again, hit two birds with one stone for the regulated community to make compliance easier, and also for data that one program can use to help the other, as also around looking at impacts to communities and potential considerations of the human right to water. So
both a great answer and a
ongoing.
perfect transition to the last couple of questions I have are for Jennifer, and talking about and working directly with disadvantaged communities and difficult areas to get water to in some cases, and certainly to get high quality drinking water that fits with the state's rights related to drinking water. You've worked with a number of the GSAs as they've formed and began doing some of their planning in communities. What are some of the lessons learned that might be applicable as management zones form or other groups work on water quality issues in these communities? I think you're on mute, Jennifer.
You're right. Thanks, Dan, and thanks, Chris and Emily, for putting this together. So when I look at the management zones and look at the GSAs, I reviewed about 30 of the plans, so I have a general overall kind of understanding of them. And I think the biggest recommendation I would have is to really pay attention to your stakeholders. And we haven't mentioned it yet, but one of the key requirements for us in the CV SALTS program is this requirement to provide interim and long-term drinking water solutions to residents impacted by nitrate contamination. And right now we're all in the throes of creating these early action plans that will kick off that process for these interim drinking water solutions. So first of all, I'd say the need to really consider the impacted communities and the stakeholders is really important. It's something that was shortchanged in many of the GSPs. So I think that we're working now to ensure that that doesn't happen. And the next thing I think is what Tess was mentioning about flexibility. And the governance for GSAs is statutorily set, and is set basically you have authority over water and land use, and you have a specific service area, and that's what you get to cover. And I think having the ability to have more impacted stakeholders on a governing board will allow you to create a better and longer lasting plan.
Do the same thing before I forget. I think that there's a lot of overlap amongst people, and we've learned a lot about how to work with communities from folks who have done that, whether they're farm communities, local communities, or disadvantaged communities. In the three programs, you know, they really all have a role in protecting drinking water for local communities. But there's both we keep talking about overlap, but are there gaps? Are there places in between programs that things have still fallen through? Or with these three programs, have we kind of covered everything that's needed?
Well, let's say we haven't covered very much yet, because right now we're just talking about it. So the only drinking water provisions that I think have come out of any of those are the state water board compliance orders in the Eastern Tulare and the Central Coast, where they've installed kiosks to help impacted communities access alternative water supplies. For CV SALTS, we're all hoping that the early action plans are going to help us bring safe drinking water to communities impacted by nitrate contamination. Those plans are in development now, and we have yet to see what they'll look like and how quickly they can be implemented. SGMA, I think, has been a total failure on water quality and providing safe drinking water, because what we've seen from the plans, both separately and collectively, is that they'll continue overdrafting the aquifers. And as you overdraft aquifers, not only do wells go dry, but you concentrate contamination. So we may be putting less nitrate in the water, but if there's less water to dilute that nitrate, that's going to have water quality impacts. And even looking at the management actions that are being considered by those groundwater sustainability agencies, almost none of those projects have looked at water quality benefits or impacts. So Tess referred to recharging clean water, and something that we all think might be a great idea is doing selective recharge of clean drinking water adjacent to impacted wells. Well, that could be great. And it could be that after the first flush of nitrates to the vadose zone, we'll get water quality improvements, but it also could be that it will mobilize additional uranium and arsenic, which we've seen in some areas. Without looking at those impacts, it's difficult to understand how the management is going to affect drinking water users. And I'd also mention that several of the monitoring programs I've looked at don't actually identify the depth of monitoring wells. So it's not clear to me that they're going to be tracking the impacts to these shallow wells.
If I
Monitoring, go ahead, Natalie.
I just
Sure.
wanted to jump in for a second and just say I really appreciate Jennifer's comments. And I heard your comment that SGMA has been a failure when it comes to protecting drinking water wells. And I hope that my program will not be a failure. This is something that the State Water Board is looking at very closely. And while I'm not DWR and can't speak for them, I know that it is an issue that they're looking at closely as well. And we, a lot of these 2020 plans have been submitted to DWR. They're being reviewed, and I think there's a lot of potential opportunities for improvement in these GSPs, especially reading, the information that's come out so far about how plans have addressed drinking water issues. They brought up some really great points. And I'm hoping that as we move forward with SGMA implementation, because we're so early in the process, as we move forward, things will continue to have a bit more focus on drinking water issues. Also, SGMA can't, it can't fix all the drinking water issues in the state. There's many communities that were in trouble before SGMA implementation, or sorry, before the legislation was even passed. And SGMA is very much looking forward from 2015 in preventing future problems. And so the board has the SAFER program, which is the implementation of the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Act, which is spooling up now, getting ready to come online and help communities with existing drinking water issues. So the board has several different angles that they're looking at drinking water. SGMA is one piece of the puzzle, but maybe not necessarily the biggest piece. But again, focused on preventing issues going forward. And I'm looking forward to plan implementation and seeing where that goes from here. And looking forward to working with our partners, of course, at DWR, NGOs, others, affected communities on talking about these issues.
I could just make a response to that. So I appreciate all that DWR and the State Water Board are doing to implement these plans, but I would just say that I totally appreciate the SAFER program. Both Tess and I did a lot of work to get that legislation passed, but I'm really concerned that all the work we've done to advance the Irrigated Lands Program and CV salts is going to be undone in the time it takes the GSAs to figure out their responsibilities around safe drinking water and water quality. And I'm glad to hear that the regulatory agencies are looking at this closely, but I just want to say that what I've seen to date has not filled me with a lot of hope, because we still don't have water quality guidance. What I noticed in the plans I reviewed is that where GSAs were given clear guidance, they generally followed it. They identified disadvantaged communities, they input climate change as directed by DWR. But because there was no guidance on water quality, there was limited guidance put out by the Water Board, but very late in the process, I think that enabled the GSAs to ignore water quality. And I think now, it's sort of like the whole source water protection things. If you don't act proactively to prevent something, it's going to cost you more time and effort to clean it up. And I think that's what we're looking at now with a lot of the groundwater sustainability plans.
So maybe I'm gonna be careful not to make any of the mistakes as best I can that any of the moderators for the last presidential and vice presidential groups made. But I have much higher quality presenters to talk to. But let's go back to that just for a moment. Maybe a question to both Natalie and Tess in talking to people who were implementing GSAs, at least early on, the answer was all we have to do is make sure we don't make it any worse than it already is. We don't have to do anything else. I know that the state board responded to that. Jennifer just mentioned the guidance that came out. Can you say something about what that guidance is, and then what will the state board's feedback to DWR be about those? There's a few of them that say doing all the things we're doing doesn't make it any better. Trust us.
So regarding the guidance, the State Water Board, the SGMA team about a year ago put out an FAQ on SGMA and water quality. The intended audience was groundwater sustainability agencies, and it has almost about just under 20, I believe, Q&A questions around SGMA, water quality, how we think it should be addressed, and where some of the issues are, and who to reach out to when you have questions. So we went ahead and released that document, and it's out there, and I hope that all GSAs have looked at it at least. And it spells out you know, not only what analytes you might want to look out for in your basins, how to look, you know, which analytes you might want to consider developing minimum thresholds for, but also where could groundwater management impact water quality? And there's one question there specifically around recharge projects, and you know, how that water quality needs to be considered when looking at recharge projects. Water going in, mobilizing potential contaminants, moving things underground, gradients, et cetera. The content is not super extensive. It's one Q&A, but it's a start on that conversation. And there's a variety of different ways that management actions and projects could impact water quality. When it comes to the state board's role when looking at these plans, DWR has the ultimate decision on whether or not plans are adequate. However, they recognize that the state water board and regional boards have long-standing regulatory experience and authorities in existing programs. And so DWR and the State Water Board are in communication. Our team is looking at plans. We're working with our regional boards to look at particular issues in plans, working with our Division of Water Quality, our GAMA team, many different teams, and sharing our thoughts with the Department of Water Resources so that we're able to support the review of plans since we have all these programs and experience.
And maybe to go back to you, Natalie and Tess both, one of the questions from one of the panelists, one of the participants was, you know, SGMA is not a drinking water program or it's a well-level program. What is its, I think the question was, what is its purpose related to water quality? Why and what kind of sampling would we expect SGMA entities likely would do in their areas?
Well, maybe I'll jump in for a little bit on that, and then Natalie can add to it. So, you know, on the SGMA side, you know, I think Natalie, you know, laid it out earlier that as I understand SGMA, your GSP basically can't create new water quality problems, is really kind of the threshold with respect to SGMA. It is not there to resolve existing drinking water issues. It's to make sure the implementation thereof doesn't create new problems through the implementation of the groundwater sustainability plans. And in all the GSPs that I've reviewed, and I haven't reviewed that many, but those that I've reviewed down in the southern San Joaquin Valley, they basically all defer to irrigated lands and CV salts with respect to, and the Safer Drinking Water Program, right? With respect to drinking water issues. You know, clearly there's collaboration and discussion going on. I think we're all trying to figure out how does that work and what does that look like? And I think it will vary depending upon the GSA and the personalities. That's just how California water works, is it's going to vary from area to area. I will say on the monitoring component, Natalie mentioned, you know, the CV salts monitoring and the GSA monitoring. There's actually a third monitoring component with the ILRP called the groundwater trend monitoring. There is a lot of discussion as to how we can combine our groundwater trend monitoring for the Irrigated Lands Program with our CV salts required monitoring, making sure that we're not duplicating. And then also talking to the GSAs that, you know, if somebody's out sampling a well, whether it's the Irrigated Lands Program or the GSA, it would be far more cost effective if that program also sampled the other entity's needs, right? Okay, we're also going to look at level. If the GSA is going out there, could you pull some nitrate samples, right? Or can you pull some samples and send them to the laboratory so we don't have multiple entities going out to the same wells to track and look at different parameters? That makes no sense for anybody. So there is a lot of discussion going on how we can collaborate, the monitoring components in particular, so we have more wells that are monitored for more parameters, including water levels, as well as the constituents. And we have the different programs that are collaborating so we can avoid duplicative cost for all of that.
Natalie, did you want to add to that, or did Tess cover it?
Tess covered it really well, and thank you for pointing out the ILRP monitoring program. I know that especially in Region 3 had a letter to all the GSAs at one point to say, hey, consider using the wells in the ILRP program too. And they've been pointing out specific plans where they did that or didn't do that as well. One thing I want to touch on with the person who asked the question about SGMA not being a drinking water program and how drinking water should be addressed under SGMA. I think the one concept that hasn't come up yet that ties SGMA and drinking water a little bit is the concept of beneficial users. GSAs are required to consider the interests of all beneficial users in their basin. And that's consider, not address. And so it's up to GSAs to figure out the balance. Drinking water users are one beneficial user. The agricultural community, those are beneficial users. There's in-stream beneficial users. There's a variety of different beneficial users and uses in all of these basins. And drinking water, public water systems, domestic well owners, that are some beneficial users that need to be considered by GSAs when developing their GSPs.
Thanks for clarifying that. I think one other question that's kind of come up from the group, and I'm going to see if I can do this. I always mess it up, but yeah, I'm going to mess it up with. PPIC did a nice summary, I thought, of different GSA plans, GSPs that had been submitted, and about 47%, their numbers were related to essentially augmenting supply or groundwater recharge to increase the amount of water that's in the basin. And in at least the plans that I've seen, mostly that was winter weather surface water, which is typically a very high quality, very low in contaminants. So that would have seems to me, some very positive effects on groundwater quality, absent the kinds of unintended consequences that Jennifer talked about that you'd certainly have to look at. If there was enough surface water to do all of that, and if that was done in those areas, does that seem like that would make a big difference? And how would we be able to identify in the different communities if there were unintended consequence from that type of large scale recharge to the groundwater basin? Who wants that one? All right, Jennifer.
A little bit. So groundwater recharge, it's a question. I think the DWR estimated maybe 20% of the overdraft could be handled through groundwater recharge. So it's a big question about how much water is actually available. I think in order to identify, I think that's why what we really wanted to see in the project actions was some kind of an analysis of what the water quality impacts might be. USGS has actually done a lot of studies about unintended consequences of recharge. And I think the issue always is you don't build all the infrastructure and then have to take it back when it's done. I think what we really need to be doing now are pilot projects, and those could start fairly short term. It's let's first investigate what we think is in the VADOS zone, whether USGS has identified in areas likely having co-contaminants or the ability to mobilize contaminants, because high quality river water tends to be a little bit higher in pH than groundwater, so it has more likelihood to strip those contaminants. And then think about what the recharge project's going to be like. Are we just going to flood every field, or are we going to have a really focused recharge basin so that if we're going to have co-contaminants, it'll be in a smaller area, so you're less likely to mobilize them. So I think that's why we really want to see some of these things moving forward. It's probably more likely they'll happen through CV salts than the GSPs at this point, but I think those are the kind of issues we'd like to see resolved.
I think I just add to Jennifer's comment about the VADA zone. I mean, my understanding, and there are, far more professional technical scientists on this call than lawyer Tess, who plays scientist on the side, that we don't know what some of the legacy nitrate loads may be in the VADA zone, right? And I think that there's a big unknown there, that with recharge, is there a time period where the recharge would mobilize the nitrate, but after, I think, Deanna, you said earlier, a period of flushing that we would then be able to, recharge with cleaner water and dilute out, existing levels of nitrate that may be there in other contaminants. So I do think that there's a lot of unknowns about the Vado zone as I understand it. And we do need to get to understand that, I think, for us to understand some of the potential unintended consequences, whether we are implementing recharge through CV salts management zone implementation plans, or we are implementing through groundwater sustainability plans, or hopefully some combination thereof.
Thanks, Tess. Thanks, Jennifer. Did we cover that, Natalie, or do you feel the need to add?
Oh, I'm on the fence.
Okay.
Nothing to ask moment, really. I think, okay, I'll add, there's a lot of potential opportunities with recharge. There are questions about, there's a lot of proposed recharge projects out there and how much water is actually available. And there's beyond that, there's a lot of questions about how recharge projects will and won't impact water quality in these basins. And so I'm looking forward to continue to have conversations with others around what GSAs can do to look out for these potential problems and issues and also solutions, and try and get that information out. We'll be, of course, talking with others, DWR as well.
And maybe just a bit of a redirect. There was a question in the chat to the panelist that asked about the state boards. Is the state board going to take a stronger stance than just informing and providing questions and answers about water quality related issues? Is there going to be a point where you might weigh in, Natalie, with DWR and recommend that that there be stronger comments or feedback to some of the GSAs related to water quality?
So when it comes to GSP review, the statute is really clear that it's DWR's decision on whether plans are adequate or inadequate. And we are looking at plans to support DWR's GSP review, but it is ultimately, as the statute says, their decision. So right now, our role is more on providing guidance. That is the role for us. And I think that when basins wind up in state intervention in the future, I would say, if I'm optimistic that we won't have any, we're doing everything we can to support basins to help them stay out of state intervention. That is our role, but we want basins to be able to implement their plans at the local level without state intervention. That is one spot where we might have an opportunity to have a stronger voice in the future. But right now, our focus is on supporting GSAs who are answering questions, supporting DWR's review, and letting DWR make their decisions on the plans.
Great, thanks, Natalie. Jennifer, a question came in asking, and I think we got this on a previous webinar as well, if there was, what are the negative impacts of, I'm going to paraphrase the question somewhat, the negative impacts of nitrate, and is blue baby syndrome the one that people think of primarily? Is that common, and if so, or if not, what are the other problems of nitrate contamination in drinking water, especially in disadvantaged communities?
So nitrate is regulated as an acute contaminant because of the potential for blue baby syndrome, where the nitrate replaces the oxygen in your blood. It has been shown to have impacts on thyroid, on infant development, and on internal issues. Sorry, I don't have my cheat sheet in front of me. I think the difficulty with identifying the prevalence of these is that people who actually drink nitrate contaminated water is a very small portion of the population. And when we've tried, and so doing epidemiological studies in the valley is very difficult because you require a certain number of people. So while the 2012 UC Davis report said that half the population of the Tulare Lake Basin and Salinas Valley had been impacted by nitrate contamination, it's actually a much smaller number that have directly ingested it. But generally speaking, the more vulnerable children, pregnant women, and the elderly are always most vulnerable to exposure.
All right, thanks for that. I think there have been a number of studies on the impacts of nitrate that go well beyond that. So we'll try to, I'm pretty sure we had an FAQ from one of our previous webinars. We'll try to make sure that those answers get into the list as well. Okay, if you're scrolling through the questions and answers, you can give it a thumbs up if you have the same question rather than rewriting it yourself. So the top vote getting question currently is, under what circumstances might a GSA need to conduct additional water quality monitoring as part of their GSP implementation, particularly in basins without nitrate or salinity issues? So I can't think of too many basins without nitrate or salinity issues, but I think that one's for you, Natalie.
Yeah, so it can be hard to give specifics without touching on individual basins, but I'm going to try to be very general. So part of writing a GSP is understanding the situation in your basin and looking at water quality constituents in your principal aquifers. How those constituents, got there, how they're impacted by different actions. And so when a GSP is, when people are writing GSPs in the 2020 basins, they've already been written. 2022 basins, that's coming up right now. There are plenty of basins with other water quality issues beyond salts and nitrates that could be impacted by management actions. Management actions including continuing drawdown of groundwater basins to a certain level. We know that if you continue pumping water out of basins, you can concentrate certain contaminants, you can potentially pull them out of layers within the aquifer and mobilize contaminants as you continue to draw down water levels. You can also have things that are, I could go on and on about different water quality issues due to continued drawdown. There's water quality issues that could be improved by recharge projects. Projects could also mobilize them. So it's when getting that initial information for the basics of the basin for that GSP, that's the opportunity to look in and look at existing water quality issues and see which ones you might need to consider and monitor for in your GSP. There's plenty of resources out there. The State Water Board has our GAMA, our Groundwater Ambient Monitoring and Assessment Program, and they have some great web tools where you could go, you can select a groundwater basin in itself, look at exceedances just for that basin. I think they actually have GSAs in there as well now, so you can narrow down all the way to the GSA area. You can look at different time ranges, different contaminant or constituents of concern. So there's lots of great information out there. There's still data gaps, of course, and GSAs will need to address that on their individual basis or for their GSP. But that's sort of the place to start and look at which contaminants should potentially be considered for sustainable management criteria or monitoring in their GSP implementation.
Daniel, you're on mute.
Thank you. To continue that question, is a little noisy in the background. It's just when the leaf blower comes by, right? When you're doing these things. I know we've had some discussion amongst several of the groups who are working on monitoring and testing of wells, and you mentioned it a little bit earlier, but it seems like an unprecedented time and an unprecedented number of wells that need to be tested, and an overlap of many different groups trying to work on that. I know from your comments before and earlier in the webinar, you talked about, you know, the people who are paying for all of this don't want to pay 14 times or twice, or even 1.5 times probably, to do the same thing. And that seems reasonable. It doesn't seem like an unreasonable thing. What suggestions do you have to the groups, since we've got a number of ILRP as well as CV SALTS folks and GSAs in one place at one time? What suggestions do you have? And then either Jennifer or Natalie, if you've got suggestions on coordinating the sampling and monitoring and kind of making it as efficient as possible.
You know, that's a really good question. I think that, you know, one of the components is, I think the Irrigated Lands Program and CV SALTS probably have a much broader perspective with respect to monitoring, right? When you put all the coalitions together and the CV SALTS monitoring, you will be looking at a much larger area base and probably more coordinated with respect to that monitoring, but it's going to be more limited in parameters, right? Because CV SALTS and the Irrigated Lands programs are going to be focused on monitoring groundwater for salts and nitrate, maybe some general, you know, cations. It's not going to be arsenic and uranium and 1,2,3 TCP. So to the extent that there are other constituents that are problematic, we know we have SAFER and self-help and others, and the technical advisors are looking at monitoring for other constituents as well. But we have to have coordination, right? And, you know, I worry that when we have, you know, programs going out saying, I'm going to go monitor domestic wells, and then another program is mandated to monitor domestic wells, people are going to get confused. And if we don't have a common message and a collaborative approach, we're going to end up with those that need their wells tested the most, so confused and fearful of having 5 people come to their house to take a sample of their domestic well that we're going to end up with none of them agreeing to participate in that program. So somehow, whether it's through, you know, CV SALTS, Irrigated Lands, GSAs, State Water Board, there has to be a coordination, or we're going to have chaos. I know that was more of a comment rather than a solution, Daniel.
I know the solution is difficult, and but the importance of finding the solutions, and they're going to be different in different areas, is I wanted to just underscore that for the group, because there's a lot that needs to be done, and it will be easier and more affordable if it's done together. Certainly, the environmental justice groups have tested, folks like self-help have tested, but those programs are small in comparison to the vast need that's out there. Natalie or Jennifer, do you have any suggestions in those as to how these 3 groups can, you know, sample and test and be more efficient gathering that data?
Yeah, Tess covered it pretty well. I think the question is that, I mean, to what extent are all the groups talking to each other? Because I don't know, the ILRP meetings I've been to, they seem pretty confused about GSP. So it's not clear to me how much interaction there currently is.
Well, thanks for the local government commission and Maven's Notebook for hosting this, right? At least getting all 3 of the groups together in one place. Natalie, did you have anything that you'd suggest?
Yeah, I was just going to say it's early on in implementation for Sigma and CV SALTS, and I know ILRP is in sort of a different phase of implementation, but because it's very early on for both Sigma and CV SALTS, this is a great opportunity for local agencies to look at both programs and implement, you know, starting from square almost one, how to combine monitoring programs when it comes to salt and nitrates. And GSAs may need to monitor for other constituents in addition, depending on their local conditions and how they define their undesirable results and their beneficial users and users. I could go on, I'm sorry. But this is a great opportunity to start early on and look for opportunities to better utilize, monitor for multiple programs at once.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, all three of you. Let's see, the top vote getter at the moment in questions is one: if a basin and its GSA does not perform to the goals in their GSP, and in doing so negatively impacts the adjacent GSA whose basin or subbasin may be connected, could enforcement or intervention come to the second GSA, the one that's doing its part, but is impacted by the one that's not? I think that's solidly you, Natalie.
So the state board can't step in whenever it wants to. There has to be a trigger for state intervention. Those triggers, I've talked about them a little bit before, but if multiple basins are implementing GSPs, then the potential trigger would be failure of that plan. So DWR is reviewing the 2020 plans now. There's 5-year check-ins, and DWR can fail a plan at any time. So it would be up to DWR to determine whether or not whatever happened constituted a plan failure. So I'm sorry, I can't really answer that question. I can just talk about my triggers for state intervention at the State Water Board.
But DWR could use an impact on an adjacent basin as a plan failure for the adjacent basin.
I didn't comment on that specifically. DWR
okay,
has
that
their GSP
way.
regulations for how they're reviewing GSPs. Okay.
All right. I didn't pick that question early on because it's not a specific one. There are a few of the questions here that are pretty specific to situations, and so I think there are obviously if you have a basin that you're managing and the adjacent basin is not managing that, you should be having those discussions with DWR and talking about them and what potential problems you see early on. You can certainly post comments directly to DWR, and I'm sure you know how to do that. So probably won't resolve those today. Speaking of things we won't resolve today, but everybody keeps voting this question up, so I'm going to give it airtime. In the statement here is that lots of water goes out to the San Francisco Bay from the treatment plants within the Central Valley and the Central Coast, and much of the water comes from the Sierras. Why can't it just go back to the valley and be used for irrigation and solve these problems? Who wants that one?
I live in San Francisco, so I drink some of that water, so maybe I can answer it.
Okay.
I think you have a good point, and I think that the Bay Area is pretty dependent on water from the Sierras, and just throwing it away is a huge waste. So I hope that the development of new regulations for direct potable reuse is going to spur the creation of more water recycling in the Bay Area. So areas like Santa Clara Valley Water District already do a lot, but because the water is so high quality, it's more difficult to get those programs going in the Bay Area. I have to say that I'm not necessarily a fan of using that for irrigation, because I think that what we've seen is that the rivers and streams, particularly in the San Joaquin Valley, are water starved, and we need to be sure of adequate flows for those streams as well. So it could be that some of that saved water, or most of it, could be used to address the environmental damage that needs to be corrected in that part of the world.
I would just add that I think, I think Maven should have a webinar on voluntary settlement agreements and Bay Delta litigation, and that would be a great question for that webinar.
And we won't be on it.
That's right. There you go.
That'd be more like a whole day.
It could be well more than a day, I'm sure. I've been to panels that didn't end on that for hours after they were supposed to in the general discussion. So there's a couple of questions I'm going to try to, rather than pose them to folks, answer quickly. One of them is, will we be discussing pathway A and B and the selection options amongst those? Those are CV salts, nitrate, control plan options, and path A is more the status quo, and path B is the management zone option that Tess discussed. And we won't probably spend time talking about those, but if you go to the cvsalinity.org website, there is whole sections on how you choose and what those choices are, and how you work on them. And if that doesn't answer your question, there's plenty of ways to submit that question, or pester Tess or I, and we can certainly get you an answer to it. There's a couple of questions, and I'm going to put them together because they're on kind of on the edge of this question. And one is, can GSPs be successful if they have subsidence, which affects groundwater quality? And what happens if the twin tunnels or the single tunnel or whichever tunnel plan, or we pull too much water out of the river? Does that affect Sigma? And I think those are intended to begin with you, Natalie, but
yeah, so when it comes to the question on the twin tunnels, I am not an expert on those by any means. What I can talk about is a little bit about surface water and projects and management actions. There's a complicated system in California with the State Water Project, the Central Valley Project, and other surface water projects to move water across the state. There's a lot involved, including the Department of Water Resources, the feds, there's water rights involved. And so that's looking at those particular issues is a bit of a deep dive that I don't think we can quite get into today, but there are plans that rely on certain water projects, and we'll see how that goes. Plan review is going on, and there's conversations to be had about that in the future.
Certainly water quality and water supply are, if you've not learned anything else today, are integrally linked. No place more than in the Central Valley, but I would say there isn't a basin I'm aware of where those two things are not critically important to all the groups who are trying to manage what drinking water, irrigation water, recycled water, all sorts of water supplies. One thing to note is there have been a bunch of really good questions, and some of the smart folks at the State Water Board, and let's see, Emily and a few others have answered those questions and provided links to where some of the materials are, and listed where slides and a copy of the webinar for today will be posted. So all those questions I didn't say anything about much because they've been answered in the answered category of your questions and answers. And I think we've gotten to most of the open questions. And I think we've got a couple of polls. Let's see if I see any new ones.
I think Daniel, I think there's two questions that can be answered very quickly.
Okay.
One was on the salinity notices of intent. I saw that question a couple of times. I think we are anticipating that those will go out soon. The regional board has just received their approval from US EPA, or will be getting it in hand shortly. So notices of intent to comply with the salt control program are imminent. There was another question about livestock and feedlots with respect to the nitrate control program. The regional board has a number of general orders for different types of livestock facilities, including dairies, poultry facilities, and they are under general orders, and they will be required to comply with the nitrate control program as with any other discharger of nitrate, less on the grazing side, but on the CAFOs, yes, they are regulated by the regional board. So I did see a couple of those and just a couple of quick answers on those.
Perfect. Thanks, Tess. So I think Chris, I think we did a good job on questions. I really appreciate everybody answering, asking the questions, because those help to get it down. Also, Tess sort of picked up on maybe future Maven's local government water management webinars, but all of that gets used to try to form how these things come together and are really valuable. And I'm sure that that makes sense to folks to be able to get those in. If there are specific questions you have for one program or the other, you now have folks you can ask in each of those programs and websites and links to go to. And I think, Chris, I'm pretty much done with my part, and you've got a couple of, you're gonna see how we did now, right?
Oh no, that was great. Thank you to all our panelists. I hope that everyone found the discussion informative. I'm going to launch just one last poll, and it's just on future topics for webinars. So if you would just answer whatever looks interesting to you. If you have any ideas, you can email me, maven@mavensnotebook.com. No topic too in the weeds for me. A copy of this webinar will be posted on Maven's Notebook YouTube channel and on the Groundwater Exchange. So I'd like to thank Tess Dunham, Natalie Stork, Jennifer Clary, Daniel Cozad, and of course the awesome Emily Finnegan and the Local Government Commission, and all of you for your participation today. So have a great afternoon, everyone.